How has Nintendo handled game releases during its console launch years in the past? What sort of games have there been? How have they been paced? What missteps and successes have they had? And what might they learn as they look forward to the Switch 2's grand debut? In this video, we are going to look through previous console launches to see what the successes and failures were of times gone by and how they might inform Nintendo's choices going into this new era. And while Nintendo was making single game handhelds and consoles of sorts as far back as the 70s, their true breakthrough, of course, was 1983's Famicom. Now, the early consoles are a little bit trickier to draw too much from in terms of the first year release schedules because it's only relatively recently that Japanese and international releases have been broadly synchronous, and even as recently as 2017, the new Nintendo 2DS XL had different release dates in different regions. Then the difference was a matter of weeks, but the Famicom released in July 1983 in Japan and yet didn't come to the West for a long time. There were test markets in New York in 1985 and Los Angeles in February of 1986, but the console was not on full nationwide release in America until the 27th of September 1986, over 3 years after its Japanese debut. Therefore, the Japanese launch is a fairer comparison point, and if we go back to the beginning, we get, of course, Donkey Kong. The Irascible Apes arcade port wasn't quite arcade perfect, but still made for an effective launch title for the Famicom in Japan in the July of 1983, while they made a bold choice of releasing Donkey Kong Jr. alongside it, doubling down on the mascot action. Popeye was the third and final game at launch. By the time the Nintendo Entertainment System hit the West, there was a deeper bench of games to draw from, including Baseball, Duck Hunt, Excite Bike, Pinball, and of course, the original Super Mario Bros. Of course, Nintendo is a vastly different company now compared to back then, and yet I think there are some interesting commonalities with today. Firstly, it is very clear that the Famicom titles were essentially geared towards marquee character appeal. They leveraged the most popular and iconic arcade classic they had in Donkey Kong, and since both DK and Popeye were big names for them, it made sense to launch with those characters in tow. This is something that we've tended to see ever since. On the other hand, the American release went for a different strategy, which is basically just to have so many games at launch that you hope something will stick. This was both possible given that they had so many Famicom games to draw from, and advisable given that they were releasing in the pre-Christmas window. Still, while the Famicom was a bit of an odd duck, the Game Boy started the tradition of much closer releases across different regions, with only 3 months separating the Japanese and American Game Boy releases. Alleyway, Baseball, and the Mahjong game Yakuman were the side games, but the main title was Super Mario Land on the Game Boy's launch, while Tetris and Tennis were added for the US release. Apart from the release of Golf, an early version of Mario Golf that hit Japan in 1989 and did not hit the West until the following year, the Game Boy did not have a deep bench of first-party games, and even 1990 didn't exactly see much first-party goodness of note, the most memorable perhaps being Dr. Mario. This was a time when Nintendo had started a dual console strategy, and 1990 also saw the launch of the Super NES with F-Zero and Super Mario World as its launch titles. Again, a marquee launch title in the form of their most marketable star, Mario, but alongside it a game that was clearly designed as a technical demonstration of the power of the system. Now, it's true that Nintendo no longer seeks to compete on technical prowess as they did during the era of the Super Famicom, but while Nintendo made their own port of SimCity in April of 1991, they didn't have another first-party title until November 1991's Zelda Triforce of the Gods, or, as it was localized in the West, A Link to the Past. People complained about 2018 being a light year for Nintendo Switch titles, and it was, but 1991 surely has to be one of the leanest ever years for first-party support on a new Nintendo console. 1996 saw the legendary Nintendo 64 hit the market, and here they repeated the Super NES's trick with Super Mario 64 and Pilotwing 64 in the USA, while in Japan, where the machine launched somewhat earlier, they also had Mario Kart 64 drifting in before the end of the year. 2001 saw the Game Boy Advance launch, and the bench of early games was by now a little deeper, with Nintendo having a roster of pre-tested franchises they could draw upon. The early days of the Game Boy Advance saw Super Mario Advance, Mario Kart Super Circuit, Golden Sun, Wario Land 4, and a little title by the name of Advance Wars, a title which wouldn't release in Japan until quite a while later. Nintendo were perhaps more focused on the GameCube, with the launch of Luigi's Mansion, Wave Race Blue Storm, and Pikmin being an interesting selection of games. Giving Luigi the spotlight as opposed to Mario was bold, but the character is so similar to Mario in look, to the casual observer at least, that perhaps they felt it a low risk, while Wave Race had become a technical yardstick as it had proved on the N64. The launch of Pikmin early on was clearly a passion project of Miyamoto's, but was also a kind of tech demo. The sheer number of characters on screen was a demonstration and really a flex of the power of the GameCube at the time. Then we have Super Smash Bros. Melee, which reinvented the N64's fifth best-selling title as a near-launch title for the GameCube. By now, we seem to have a much tighter syncing of the launch window titles across the world, and frankly, a much stronger emphasis on huge quality titles, and a good number of them. The GameCube was to struggle a lot more in its second full year on the market, although still its first calendar year, for volume of games, but hardly for quality, with Super Mario Sunshine, Animal Crossing, Star Fox Adventures, Mario Party 4, and Metroid Prime all launching. Of course, only Mario's series were well established, as this was the first Western Animal Crossing game, and quite different takes on Metroid and Star Fox than had been prevalent before. Nevertheless, on paper, you would think that Nintendo had cracked the perfect launch window with the GameCube. Oh yeah, and did I mention that in December 2002, Japan also got Zelda Wind Waker? And yet, the GameCube did not really make a massive dent in the marketplace at this time, and within a few years, news of the Nintendo Revolution was starting to emerge. I think most of us would look now at a launch lineup like this and say that if Nintendo could match this with the Switch 2, they'd be home and dry, but how much of a template is GameCube really? The thing is, the GameCube lacked for third-party support, and this really hurt a console that was being pushed as a top-of-the-line example of power. Maybe it could run games better than the competition, but for those not interested in Nintendo's core lineup, it simply didn't. I think Switch 2 has, from all reports and expectations, solved this critical issue. Switch seems to be one of the Nintendo's easier consoles to program for, and you have to expect that Switch 2 will be similar. Still, Nintendo seemed to learn what I consider to be the wrong lesson from the GameCube, as not all of its future consoles would have such muscular launch window game libraries. The DS launched in Japan with Super Mario 64 DS and Pokemon Dash, with WarioWare Touched coming the same year in Japan, but the following year in the West. Since DS released so late in the year, it's only fair to look at 2005 as the first full year, and while there are major marquee titles such as Mario Kart DS, Kirby Canvas Curse, and Animal Crossing Wild World, it is notable that there was a far bigger focus on experimental titles, Brain Age, Nintendogs, Clubhouse Games, as well as Luigi's Mansion-style experimental side titles like Super Princess Peach and the first Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game. The DS's lineup was dense and the system was doubtless well supported, but when you look at the final top 10 of all-time Nintendo DS sellers, not only is it very stacked towards the first 12 months or so's games, but that Nintendogs and the Brain Age games were actually some of the bigger sellers overall. The lesson? Iwata's Blue Ocean casual-focused strategy could bear fruit, a lesson that was to be implemented further when it came to the Nintendo Wii. The Wii launch is one of the most interesting of all because it is the first Nintendo console to launch without any form of Mario representation, even in the form of Luigi or Mario in a Donkey Kong game. I'm not sure this was from lack of trying. I've talked elsewhere about the EPD8 team in Tokyo who produced the 3D Mario games and the struggles they had getting Super Mario Galaxy ready as early as they'd hoped. Still, the decision to pivot to Zelda as a launch game was significant. Until 2017, Zelda was never as huge a title as Mario was, and the games had slightly more of a Western appeal than they did even in Japan. And alongside this was Wii Sports, a casual focused game where there were no iconic characters except for the Mii's. The second year of Wii had a decent number of games: WarioWare Smooth Moves, Super Mario Party, Pokemon Battle Revolution, Mario Strikers Charged, Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn, Mario Party 8, Link's Crossbow Training, and Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, before they marked the second holiday season and the end of the first 12 months with Super Mario Galaxy. While these series might not all have been as iconic as the GameCube's library, recall that back then, titles like Pikmin and Animal Crossing, plus even Metroid Prime, were new and experimental. They turned out to be huge parts of Nintendo's future, but they could have ended up as obscure as Starfy or Doshin the Giant. Still, Wii's success yet again rested heavily on the outsized performance of its casual titles, and so when the 3DS launched, it did so with Pilot Wings, Steel Diver, and Nintendogs plus Cats. No Mario, not even Zelda, whose Hero of Time wouldn't make the 3DS until Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D, which, alongside Star Fox 3D, made for a curiously port-heavy launch. It was November and December before Super Mario 3D Land and Mario Kart 7 arrived to give the 3DS the strength and depth it needed for marquee characters, and arguably by then, the early momentum of the console had been lost. The Wii U doubled down on this mistake. Sure, Nintendo Land and Sing Party could have been as huge as Wii Sports and Nintendogs, but they weren't, and Nintendo didn't have a second string to their bow. New Super Mario Bros. U was, yes, a Mario game in their strongest performing series, but it hardly counted as a technical marvel. This was an odd choice in many respects, since while the Wii U continued Nintendo's blue ocean approach of using less powerful tech than the top-of-the-range consoles, it launched with a year to go before Xbox One and PlayStation 4 would be released, and was a far newer console than the aging PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, and so had a chance to at least try and compete, particularly in Mario, where there was no point of comparison to previous Mario games since they had already been on the less powerful Wii hardware. Of course, 2013 also turned out to be a rather bare-bones year for the dear old Wii U, and while the second half of the year picked up steam with Pikmin 3, Super Mario 3D World, and Zelda Wind Waker HD, it was, in many respects, far too late. Which brings us to the Nintendo Switch. This console was in a perilous position at launch because the company was still supporting two lines of game production, for home consoles and handhelds, while the fallow years of the early 2010s meant that their game development resources were limited. Given this, it's incredible in retrospect that they put out such a strong showing up front. At launch, Zelda Breath of the Wild was obviously the killer app, but 1-2-Switch was being pushed by Nintendo, and particularly by Yoshiaki Koizumi, as having the potential to be another Wii Fit-style breakout experience. Clearly that did not happen, but it seems to me that Nintendo will still aim to have some kind of novel experience to launch Switch 2, if possible. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, 1 month in, obviously was a huge boon to the emergent Switch, as the Wii U's small install base meant that only 8 million had owned it already, a large number, but a fraction of what previous installments in the series had shifted. ARMS and Splatoon 2 kept Nintendo going over the summer, and then in the holiday window they had Pokken Tournament, Fire Emblem Warriors, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and of course, Super Mario Odyssey. By sheer volume of games, the first year of the Switch was actually far below what we've come to expect in recent years, but the quality of those games and the ambition was evident. So what does this tell us about the first year or so of Switch 2? What lessons can we draw? Well, most obviously, I think we can see the importance historically of big marquee characters. Since 1983, having a big name character at launch has been key, and Nintendo are, after all, arguably more of an IP company than ever. Historically, this has been Zelda or Mario, and while they've tried their luck without them, it did not end well. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Mario has to be there on launch day, but Mario Kart is obviously a strong likelihood. Another option, though, would be that they have a Mario-themed game which is not Mario Kart on day one, perhaps a casual title alongside Metroid Prime 4. For example, if they had a new Mario Paint title or some other game that showcases some of the unique selling points of the Switch 2, they could add in one of their key marquee characters, probably Mario, in order to front it. Beyond that, I think they know that as successful as the Switch has been, third-party support is huge for them if they want to avoid going down the route of the GameCube. Clearly, third-party support isn't all there is to it, as the Wii U showed, and I think they learned very strongly from the Switch that having a dense lineup of games is incredibly helpful, and I think it's hugely unlikely that the Switch 2 will have many, or even any, gaps of more than 2 months between first-party games in the first few years. Switch 2 also has a leg up from past consoles in that it can leverage the original Switch games because of its backwards compatibility. This is particularly valuable in the case of Pokemon Legends ZA. Mainline Pokemon titles, even non-generational titles like Legends Arceus, have always put in gangbuster numbers, and while the DS didn't have such a Pokemon offering in 2011 to weigh in behind the 3DS, giving a big, forward-compatible game to the Nintendo Switch and Switch 2 has to be helpful. And so, before we even know much about the contours of the coming year for games, Switch 2 does seem like it has to be in a strong position compared to past consoles. But what else can we infer from the past? One thing is that Nintendo can afford to coast without a strong lineup of games if the games they do provide are truly excellent, and particularly if they can have even just one truly huge killer app. The Super NES is a classic example where Super Mario World was such an incredible title, and the machine was sufficiently iterative that they could kind of coast for a while. It's not that the Super NES blew the doors off the sales records in the same way that the Famicom had, and the Wii and the Switch one day would, but even when the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis was already on the market and had quite a considerable head start, the Super NES still performed respectably based on its own momentum. They proved this again in 2017 when the Switch was widely dismissed early on as being a Zelda machine for the first few months. Though frankly, when the Zelda in question is Breath of the Wild, I remember thinking at the time that this was hardly much of a criticism. But maybe if you don't have a killer app, things go wrong. If Nintendo Land had been a massive hit, maybe things could have been different for Wii U. It was no weirder a concept as a console in many respects than the DS was in its day, and for 3DS, while it made sense to launch with Nintendogs and Cats, I feel like fundamentally this is an experience that was reiterating the greatest hits of the DS and not doing something bold and new with the admittedly impressive 3D experience. Now here's the thing, you can't necessarily predict what will be a Wii Sports and a Nintendogs and what will be a Sing Party or a 1-2 Switch. These things may seem obvious in hindsight, but I'm dubious that anybody could really have anticipated Brain Training being the gigantic hit that it became. Nor does it seem to matter whether this killer app game is a traditional title. Super Mario World, an arcade port of Donkey Kong, or Zelda Breath of the Wild, or something completely new like Nintendogs or Wii Sports. Also, while there are consoles that have had rather anemic starts but which ended up being huge successes, the Game Boy perhaps being the premier example of the species, because who knew that Tetris would be so massive, the first year usually has a good chunk of the titles that will become the major evergreens that support the console. Looking at the top 10 sales on Nintendo's website, 3 of the Switch titles are from the first 12 months, 5 of the Wii U games, 2 of the 3DS games, 5 of the DS games, and 3 Wii games. It shouldn't be a surprise that games which are on the system longer sell better, but by any measure there is a disproportionate influence of those first impression titles. There's also, to be fair, a biasing effect from pack-in titles, but it's also that these titles set the weather. Yes, a lot of people bought Wii Sports as a pack-in for the Wii, but you don't shift 82.9 million units if the game itself doesn't have star power. Wii Sports is the top-selling Wii game, Nintendogs the second best-selling DS game, Super Mario World the best-selling SNES game, Super Mario 64 the best-selling N64 title, and you get the idea about how those launch titles really do set the scene for the success of the console to come. Breath of the Wild isn't in the top 2 for Switch, but it's 4th, which when you consider how long-lived the console has been, and how relatively unsuccessful Zelda was before, and how many games the Switch now boasts, it still is a pretty phenomenal achievement. Now, we know to expect Metroid Prime 4, and I love Metroid and I'm psyched for Prime 4, but let's face it, Metroid Prime 4 is never going to be a top 2 system seller in the medium term at least, and even if it cracks 10 million, it would be frankly astonishing given the series' anemic sales history, even when given prestige slots. But then again, Mario Kart is, well, it's the surefire thing. DS, 3DS, Wii U, Switch, they all have Mario Kart, and usually quite early, but they didn't rely on Mario Kart. Mario Kart, it seems to me, is very much the backstop game. If nothing else sells, Mario Kart will. Same with 3D Mario, a title that now seems likely to push towards later in the year or even potentially into 2026 to tie into the second Super Mario movie. Now, it's possible that Nintendo can do very well purely on their backstop titles. The top 10 of Switch certainly reads as a rundown of its major marquee franchises. Even a success like Ring Fit Adventure didn't break the top 10. But this, Switch 2, is their big roll of the dice. A new system, new tech, a new audience, and a new chance to experiment. And they've had 8 years, more than 8 years in fact, to get this right. I think they will be another launch title, and I think they will be very specifically targeting something on the scale of Wii Sports and not just a 1-2 switch. That's obviously a difficult one to predict with any certainty, but I think this, more than anything, may be the key determinant of Switch 2's long-term success. But that is going to be a separate topic for a separate video, and so in the meantime, please do like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you so much as ever to my Patreon supporters, and I shall see you soon for another Nintendo Forecast.